Welcome to a special compilation of our most chilling tales. Tonight we present a curated collection of our best stories, narratives that peel back the layers of reality to reveal the unsettling mysteries that lie beneath. These are the stories that have haunted our dreams and stirred our deepest fears. Tales spun from shadows whispered in the dark, and now brought together for an unforgettable journey into the dark domain. But beware, once you enter this realm, there's no turning back, unless you offer a like and subscribe as a small token to appease the spirits. After all, even the fictional enjoy a bit of acknowledgement from the living. So settle in, dim the lights, and prepare yourself, because tonight, the boundaries between reality and the unknown fade away. The others beneath. I've been working maintenance for the city of Portland, Maine for 10 years. Most of the time, it's an easy job, fixing pipes, dealing with sewage backups, things like that. The sewers aren't glamorous, but they're predictable, or at least they were. It started 2 weeks ago with the smell. People in the old Port District began complaining about it. Something worse than the usual funk of rotting fish and low tide. This was different, stronger, almost chemical. By the time the complaints reached my department, the smell had spread across half the city. I got the call from my boss, Gary, early in the morning. He told me to grab my gear and meet him at the corner of Middle and Exchange, where the smell was at its worst. When I arrived, Gary was already there, leaning against the city truck, his face twisted in disgust. "Jesus, you smell that?" he asked, waving a hand in front of his nose. I nodded. It was hard not to. The odor was overwhelming, thick in the air like a cloud of invisible smoke. It made my eyes water. "Something's backed up," I said. "Probably a broken line." Gary shook his head. "Already checked. There's nothing on our end. Whatever it is, it's not normal." He handed me a flashlight and pointed to the manhole cover in the middle of the street. "We gotta go down there and check it out." I didn't like the sound of that. The sewers in this part of town were old, some of the oldest in the country. Built in the 1800s, most of the original brickwork was still intact, but it wasn't exactly stable. The city had been putting off repairs for years, and some sections were practically crumbling. Still, it was my job, and I wasn't going to argue with Gary. I lifted the heavy manhole cover and climbed down the iron rungs into the darkness below. The smell hit me first. It was even worse underground, a choking stench of rot and something else. Something metallic, like rusted iron. I clicked on my flashlight and started walking through the narrow tunnel, my boots sloshing through the muck. Gary followed close behind, his own light bobbing as we moved deeper into the system. The walls were slick with moisture, the sound of dripping water echoing around us. But there was something else, too. A low, almost imperceptible hum. It vibrated through the brick, making the air feel heavy. "Do you hear that?" I asked, stopping to listen. Gary frowned, shining his light around the tunnel. "Yeah, what is that?" I shook my head. I didn't know. We kept moving, following the sound as it grew louder. The further we went, the worse the smell got, and soon it was so overpowering I had to pull my shirt up over my mouth just to breathe. We rounded a corner, and that's when we saw it. The water in the tunnel was different. It wasn't the usual dirty brown sludge. It was black, thick, and it was moving. "Jesus Christ," Gary muttered, taking a step back. I crouched down, shining my light on the surface of the water. It wasn't just moving with the current. It was bubbling, like something beneath the surface was trying to break through. "We need to report this," I said, standing up. "Whatever's down here, it's not just a clog." Gary didn't argue. We turned to head back, but the tunnel behind us had changed. The air was colder, the hum louder, and the walls, they didn't look right. The bricks were darker, older, as if we'd somehow stepped into a part of the sewer that hadn't been touched in centuries. "I don't remember this part," Gary said, his voice uneasy. Neither did I. We kept moving faster now, but the further we went, the more twisted the tunnel became. The brickwork was warped, bulging in places, the mortar cracked and crumbling. Something had been down here, something powerful enough to tear through solid stone. Then we heard it, the sound of something moving in the water behind us. I stopped, turning to shine my light back down the tunnel. The black water was rippling, and for a moment, I thought I saw something break the surface. A hand, pale, bloated. "Run," I whispered, grabbing Gary's arm. We took off, sprinting through the narrow tunnel, our lights bouncing wildly. The sound of splashing grew louder behind us, like something massive was dragging itself through the water, gaining on us. I didn't dare look back. We reached a junction and I skidded to a stop, breathing hard. Gary bent over, hands on his knees, gasping for air. "What the hell was that?" he wheezed. "I don't know," I said, shining my light back down the tunnel. The water was still now, but the hum, it was deafening. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. "Now!" Gary didn't argue. We started running again, but the tunnel kept twisting, leading us deeper underground instead of toward the surface. The walls were different now, no longer brick, but stone. Smooth. Carved. "This isn't right," Gary said, panic creeping into his voice. "We shouldn't be this far down." But we were. Somehow the sewer had changed. It wasn't just a system of tunnels anymore. It was something older, something alive. We reached another junction, and that's when we saw it. The thing was massive, its pale, bloated body rising out of the black water like some kind of grotesque sea creature. Its skin was slick, translucent, the veins beneath pulsing with that same rhythmic hum. It had no eyes, just a gaping circular mouth lined with rows of needle-like teeth. And it wasn't alone. Behind it, more figures emerged from the water. Smaller, humanoid shapes. Their skin was pale and bloated, their eyes black and sunken. They moved toward us, silent, their mouths hanging open as if they were gasping for air. "We need to move!" Gary shouted, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was frozen, staring at the thing as it loomed over us, its mouth opening wider, wider. Gary grabbed me, snapping me out of it. We ran, dodging through the maze of tunnels, the sound of those things splashing through the water close behind. I don't know how long we ran, but eventually we found our way back. The tunnel changed again, the stone walls giving way to the familiar brick of the city sewer system. We climbed the rungs, pulling ourselves out of the manhole and into the blinding light of the afternoon sun. We didn't talk about it. We just climbed into the truck and drove. That was 2 weeks ago. Gary quit the next day. I haven't been back down there since, but the smell is still here. And every night when I close my eyes, I hear it. The hum, growing louder, closer. Something's down there, something old, something that shouldn't exist. And I know it's waiting. The Man with the Voice. I've been a detective in Cedar Rapids for nearly 15 years. I've seen my fair share of strange things, cases that don't add up, suspects that vanish without a trace, even a few that left me questioning my own sanity. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for the case of Elliot Pierce. It started on a chilly Friday morning. I was sitting at my desk nursing a cup of coffee when the call came in. A woman, Rebecca Hastings, had barricaded herself in her office at a local law firm. She wasn't answering the phone, and her coworkers said she'd been acting strange for days, talking about how someone was controlling her. When I arrived, the scene was already tense. Her office door was locked from the inside, and her colleagues were standing outside, wide-eyed and anxious. I knocked on the door, trying to calm her down. "Rebecca, this is Detective Jacob Lee. Can you hear me? We're here to help." There was silence for a moment, then a faint voice from the other side. "He's inside my head." My stomach dropped. I motioned for my partner to step back as I leaned closer to the door. "Rebecca, who's inside your head? Who's doing this?" Again, a long pause, then she whispered, "The man with the voice." It took us an hour to coax her out of the office. When she finally opened the door, she looked exhausted, her eyes sunken and hollow. I tried to get her to explain what had happened, but her answers were fragmented, disjointed. She kept insisting that a man she had never met, was speaking to her, telling her what to do, controlling her thoughts. At first, I thought she was having a breakdown. Maybe the pressure of her job had gotten to her, or maybe there was something more serious going on mentally. But when I dug deeper, I found that Rebecca wasn't the first person to say something like this. There had been 3 other cases in the past month, people who claimed they were being controlled by a voice in their heads. All of them described the same thing: a man they couldn't see, whose voice would seep into their minds, making them do things they would never do on their own. 2 of those people were dead. I tracked down one of the survivors, a man named Brian Sims, who had been hospitalized after attempting to walk into traffic. He had survived, but only just. When I spoke to him, he was sitting in a small, sterile hospital room, staring blankly out the window. "Brian," I began, "I'm investigating what happened to you. Can you tell me about the man who spoke to you?" He didn't turn to look at me. His voice was flat, emotionless. "He doesn't speak to me anymore." I waited for a moment, then pressed on. "Who is he?" Brian finally turned to face me. His eyes were wide, haunted. "I don't know." But his voice, it was like he was inside my mind. I couldn't block it out. He told me to step into the street. I didn't want to, but I couldn't stop myself. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Did you ever see him? Did he come to you in person?" Brian shook his head. "No, he doesn't need to. Once he finds you, it's over." The more I investigated, the more I realized that these people weren't connected. They didn't work together, didn't frequent the same places, didn't even live in the same neighborhoods. But they all described the same sensation: the voice, the control, the helplessness. Then, about a week after my conversation with Brian, I got a call that made my blood run cold. It was from a man named Elliot Pierce. I had never heard of him before, but he seemed to know everything about me. "Detective Lee," the voice on the other end of the line said, smooth and confident. "I hear you've been asking about me." I froze. There was something about his tone that sent alarm bells ringing in my head. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice steady, though my heart was racing. "You already know," he replied. "I'm the man with the voice." I didn't know what to say. 1,000 thoughts were racing through my mind. Was this the guy behind everything? Could he really do what they said he could? "You've been causing quite a stir, Detective," Pierce continued, sounding almost amused. "I'm not sure I appreciate that." "What do you want?" I asked, gripping the phone tighter. There was a long silence on the other end, and for a moment, I thought he had hung up. Then he spoke again, his voice softer, more menacing. "I want you to understand how easy it is. How easy it is to control someone's mind, to make them do things they wouldn't normally do, things they can't explain." My pulse quickened. "Is that what you've been doing? To Rebecca? To Brian? To all those people?" "Oh, I didn't have to work very hard with them," he said, his tone light. "You see, some people are more susceptible to suggestion. But you, Detective, I think you're different." My mouth went dry. What's that supposed to mean? Another pause, and then his voice dropped to a whisper. "You'll find out soon enough." The line went dead. After that call, I didn't sleep for days. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for Pierce to make his move. But nothing happened. For weeks, it was radio silence. I was starting to think maybe it had all been a sick game, that maybe he'd moved on to another victim. But then one night I woke up in the middle of the night gasping for air. It wasn't a dream. His voice, Pierce's voice, was in my head, as clear as if he were standing right beside me. "It's time, Detective," the voice whispered. "Get up." I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a bad dream, but the voice persisted. "Go to the window," it commanded. My body moved on its own. I walked to the window, every muscle in my body tense, my mind screaming to stop. But I couldn't. The voice was in control. "Now open the window!" I did as I was told, my hands trembling as I pushed the window open, the cold night air hitting my face. "Jump," Pierce's voice whispered, smooth and calm. I stood there, frozen, staring down at the street below. It wasn't a long fall, but it would be enough. "Jump, detective!" I fought against the voice, my mind screaming for control. I felt myself stepping closer to the ledge, my feet moving without my consent. Sweat dripped down my face as I struggled, every ounce of my willpower focused on stopping. Then, just as I was about to step off the ledge, the voice stopped. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my body shaking. I don't know how long I sat there, but when I finally looked up, I realized something. The phone on my nightstand was ringing. Slowly, I reached for it, my hand still trembling. "Detective Lee," Pierce's voice said on the other end, cool and detached. "You're not as easy as I thought, but don't worry. I'll be seeing you again soon." The line went dead. I never heard from Pierce after that night, but I know he's still out there, waiting, watching. And I know that one day I'll hear his voice again. When I do, I'm not sure I'll be able to fight it a second time. The last word. Some people live their entire lives in the shadows, pulling strings, making decisions that ripple out into the world without anyone ever knowing their names. I used to think those people were just the stuff of conspiracy theories, the paranoia of folks with too much time on their hands. Then I became one of them. My name is Michael Cole, and for the last 15 years I worked for an organization you've never heard of. My job wasn't glamorous. I wasn't some James Bond type. My job was simple. I wrote history. Not in the sense that I documented it, but in the sense that I made sure the right stories were told while the wrong ones vanished. I controlled information. I decided what the public got to know and what would be buried in classified files never to see the light of day. I'd been good at it. Really good. But as I sit here tonight staring out at the skyline of Louisville from this dingy motel room, I know my time's almost up. They'll be coming for me soon. I've seen it happen to the best of us. But before they do, I have to get this story out. My last assignment. It started 6 months ago when I received a directive that was unlike any I'd gotten before. Usually I'm sent after people, journalists sniffing too close to classified material, whistleblowers trying to leak government secrets. But this time it wasn't a person. It was a book. A self-published, barely noticed book that had been written by some nobody living on the outskirts of Louisville. The author, Alan Preston, was an English professor at a local college. A small-time guy, no following to speak of. The book was a collection of essays and short stories, the kind of thing that might have sold a few dozen copies to his students, or ended up in the bargain bin at a used bookstore. Except there was something in that book, something buried between the fiction and rambling essays, that had caught the attention of people much higher up than me. I was sent to Louisville under the guise of a journalist myself, looking to interview Preston about his book for a small literary magazine. My real mission, though, was clear. Find out what Preston knew, how he knew it, and make sure that knowledge disappeared. The first time I met him, he seemed like a regular guy. Mid-50s, balding with a slight hunch in his posture. His office at the college was cramped, filled with piles of papers and dusty old books. He welcomed me in with a tired smile, clearly flattered that anyone was even interested in his work. We made small talk, and I played the part of an enthusiastic writer fascinated by his book. But the more we talked, the more I realized that Preston wasn't just some harmless academic with an overactive imagination. There was something deeper, something darker behind his words. He started talking about power, about control, about how governments don't just rule, they shape reality itself. He spoke in riddles, referencing events that had never made it into the history books, but that I knew were real. Assassinations, black ops missions, coups staged in far-off countries. He knew things he shouldn't have known. At first, I thought he might just be a conspiracy theorist who'd gotten lucky, stumbled onto a few breadcrumbs and pieced them together. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I never really believed it myself. Thought it was all just stories, something to scare the kids with. But after what I found, well, it's hard to ignore the truth, isn't it?" "What truth?" I asked, keeping my voice calm, though my heart was pounding. Preston smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "That everything we know, everything we believe, is a lie. And it's people like you who make sure we stay in the dark." I left his office that day knowing I couldn't take any chances. Preston was dangerous, not in the traditional sense, but because he had tapped into something real. He wasn't supposed to know about the things he did, and that made him a threat. I reported back to my superiors, recommending that the book be pulled, that Preston be dealt with quietly. But the response I got was different than I expected. They didn't want him silenced. They wanted him watched. I spent the next few months shadowing Preston, watching his every move, monitoring his communications. For a while, nothing happened. He went about his life, teaching classes, writing in his office, occasionally working on another book. But then, one night, something changed. I intercepted an email he had sent to a journalist, a real journalist this time, talking about the documents. He claimed to have found proof of something that could blow the lid off the entire system. He didn't go into details in the email, but it was enough to send up red flags. The next day, Preston disappeared. I searched everywhere. His home, his office, even the places he frequented around town. There was no sign of him, no trail to follow. It was as if he had been erased. My superiors were furious. They blamed me for letting him slip through the cracks, for not neutralizing the threat sooner. I knew what was coming. I'd seen it happen before. When someone in my position failed, they didn't get a second chance. But I wasn't going to go down that easily. I started digging through Preston's files, searching for any clue about where he might have gone or what he was planning. And that's when I found it, the real manuscript. The one he hadn't published. The one that had been hidden in plain sight. It was a detailed account of the last 50 years of global history, filled with names, dates, operations I'd been involved in. It wasn't fiction, it was the truth. The kind of truth that could unravel everything. Preston had somehow stumbled onto classified files, the kind of files that should have been locked away in vaults deep underground. He knew about the operations I had erased from history, the ones I'd made sure never saw the light of day. He knew about me. Now I'm sitting here in this motel room waiting for the inevitable knock on the door. I don't know if Preston is still out there, somewhere in the shadows, or if they've already found him. But I do know this. He was right. Everything we believe, everything we know, it's all been shaped, molded, controlled by people like me. And I'm done with it. This is my confession. The truth, buried in the noise of the world. Maybe no one will ever read this. Maybe it'll just fade away, like so many other stories I've buried. But if you're reading this, know that the truth is out there, and sometimes it's the last thing you ever want to find. The Rusted Men. I'd been a harbor patrol officer in Charleston for the better part of 10 years. Nothing about it was glamorous. My nights were spent navigating the marshes, the long stretches of silent water, checking for stranded boats or broken down engines. A lot of nothing, mostly. It was peaceful in its own way until you saw something that didn't make sense. My name is Officer Glenn Carter, and last month I found something I wish I hadn't. It started with a radio call, a distress signal from an old ship that had long been written off the records. The Carolina Breeze, a cargo vessel that was decommissioned 2 decades ago. She'd been left to rust at a scrapyard upstate. How her call came through again? Well, that's where this story begins. It was late when the message came through. I was working the night shift, the air humid and still, when the crackle of an old radio frequency cut through the silence. At first I thought it was static, but then I heard the voice, a man's voice, garbled and faint, repeating the ship's name and position. "This is the Carolina Breeze. We need assistance. Anyone receiving, please respond." I nearly dropped the radio. The Carolina Breeze had been scrapped in '94. No crew, no captain, just a rusting heap that had been torn apart for scrap. But the coordinates were clear. It was out there, somewhere in the harbor, asking for help. I took the patrol boat out, navigating through the maze of marshy channels, the beam of my spotlight cutting through the fog. I wasn't expecting to find much. Maybe just a hoax, someone playing a trick on the harbor patrol. But when I reached the coordinates, my stomach dropped. There she was, the Carolina Breeze looming out of the mist, her hull covered in rust, her masts half collapsed, leaning to one side like a ship that had been forgotten by time. I pulled the boat alongside her, heart pounding in my chest. The ship was silent. No lights, no signs of life, just the steady creak of metal groaning in the breeze. I called out, but no one answered. It didn't make sense. The ship had been decommissioned. It shouldn't be floating out here, let alone broadcasting a distress signal. But I had to know what was going on. I had to see for myself. Climbing aboard, the first thing that hit me was the smell. Metallic, like rust and seawater, but heavier, more suffocating. The deck was slick with moisture, the wood rotting beneath my boots. Every step felt unstable, like the ship was waiting for the right moment to sink. I made my way toward the bridge, the air thick with an unnatural quiet. As I passed the cargo holds, I noticed something strange. The walls were covered in rust, but it wasn't the usual corrosion. The rust seemed alive. It pulsed like it was spreading in real time, creeping across the metal in thin, spider-like veins. When I reached the bridge, I found the radio. It was old, outdated, the kind of equipment that hadn't been used in decades. But it was still on, still broadcasting that same faint distress signal. "This is the Carolina Breeze. We need assistance." I picked up the receiver, my hand shaking. "This is Officer Glenn Carter with Charleston Harbor Patrol. Who am I speaking with?" The radio crackled for a moment, then went silent. And then I heard it, a soft shuffle like footsteps coming from the lower deck. I grabbed my flashlight and moved toward the sound, descending into the lower levels of the ship. The air down there was worse, thick with the stench of decay, and the rust was everywhere, crawling across the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. It felt like the ship was dying, like something was eating away at it from the inside. That's when I saw them. 3 men, huddled in the corner of the engine room, their backs turned to me. They were wearing old, tattered uniforms, the kind sailors used to wear decades ago. But something was wrong. Their skin was pale, almost gray, and their hair hung in thin, matted clumps. "Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing through the room. "Are you the crew? What's going on here?" Slowly, one of them turned to face me, and I took a step back, the breath catching in my throat. His face, his skin wasn't just pale, it was rusted. Patches of metal seemed to be growing out of him, his flesh merging with the ship, his eyes dull and lifeless. The veins of rust I'd seen on the walls were spreading across his body, like some kind of infection twisting through his skin, pulling him apart. "We need help," he croaked, his voice weak and broken. "We can't leave." I backed away, panic rising in my chest. The other 2 men turned to me then, their bodies in the same horrifying state, rust growing through their skin like they'd become part of the ship. One of them tried to stand, but his legs buckled and he collapsed onto the floor with a sickening crack. "What happened to you?" I whispered, my hands trembling as I held the flashlight. "We stayed too long," the first man rasped. "The ship, it's taking us. It's feeding." I didn't understand what he meant, but I didn't need to. I had to get out of there. Whatever was happening on that ship, whatever had turned those men into, whatever they were, it wasn't natural. It wasn't right. I turned and bolted for the deck, the sound of the men's wheezing breaths echoing behind me. As I reached the top, I heard one last, desperate plea. "Help us!" I stumbled back onto the patrol boat, the ship looming over me like a rotting carcass. I gunned the engine and sped away, not daring to look back until the Carolina breeze was nothing but a silhouette in the mist. Back on shore, I reported what I'd seen, but no one believed me. They sent out a search team, but when they reached the coordinates, the ship was gone. The Carolina breeze had vanished. I don't know where that ship went or what happened to the men aboard her, but I can still feel it. That creeping rust, that suffocating smell. It's been weeks, and every night I dream of the ship, adrift in the mist waiting for its next victim. Sometimes when I'm alone, I hear the sound of the radio, just a faint crackle, whispering through the static. "This is the Carolina breeze, and we need assistance." The feeding. Working the night shift at a diner isn't exactly glamorous, but it's honest work. The kind of work where the hours are long, the customers are rough around the edges, and the pay barely covers the rent. But it keeps you going, keeps you moving. My name is Eric Keaton, and for the past 6 months I've been working at Bobby's all-night diner, just off the highway that runs through Flagstaff. I'd landed the job after moving here to get away from some personal issues, trying to find a fresh start in the desert. It wasn't much, but it was a quiet place to clear my head and put some distance between me and my old life. But lately, things had been different. It started small, just the way these things do. Little signs that something wasn't right. A few weeks ago, we began noticing the smell. It was faint at first, like something spoiled, hidden behind the usual odors of greasy food and burnt coffee. We thought it was a dead animal caught in the walls or something, but no matter how hard we searched, we couldn't find the source. Then the customers started talking about it. It wasn't just a smell, it was a hunger. People would come in late at night, ravenous, ordering piles of food like they hadn't eaten in days. I'm talking about regulars who usually stopped in for a coffee and a slice of pie, now suddenly demanding burgers, steaks, fries, anything they could get their hands on. But no matter how much they ate, it never seemed to be enough. One night after closing up, I stayed late to clean up. The diner was empty, the only sound coming from the hum of the neon sign outside flickering in the darkness. I was wiping down the counter when I heard something. A rustling sound, like paper being crumpled, coming from the kitchen. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check it out, figuring it was just a rat or something. But when I opened the door, the smell hit me. It was stronger now, thick and overwhelming, like rot and decay. I shined the light around the kitchen, but everything looked normal until I saw the freezer. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for the stench to be pouring out. I approached it cautiously, my stomach churning as I reached out and pulled the door open. The light flickered, and for a second I thought I saw something. A shape, something large, hunched over in the corner of the freezer. But when I blinked, it was gone. The freezer was empty except for a pile of raw meat that had been ripped apart, scattered across the floor. I slammed the door shut and backed out of the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild after a long shift. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next night, things got worse. It was around 2 a.m., the dead hour when the highway was quiet and the diner was nearly empty. Just a couple of truckers sitting in a booth, nursing their coffee. I was behind the counter when a man walked in. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were dirty, his hair a mess, and his eyes were sunken, hollow, like he'd been running from something. He walked up to the counter, his gaze locked on the menu hanging above my head. "You got any food left?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Yeah, kitchen's open," I said. "What can I get you?" He didn't answer at first, just stared at the menu, his lips twitching. Then he looked at me, and I'll never forget the look in his eyes. "I need meat," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Something raw. I can't." He stopped, clutching his stomach. I can't stop the hunger. I stepped back, my hand instinctively moving to the phone under the counter. "You okay, man? Maybe you should sit down." But before I could say anything else, he lunged across the counter, his hands grabbing the edges as he pulled himself toward me, his eyes wide with desperation. "Please," he gasped. "You don't understand. It's in me. It's in all of us." I froze, my mind racing as I tried to process what was happening. His grip on the counter was so tight his knuckles turned white, and I could see the veins in his arms bulging, his body trembling like he was fighting something inside himself. And then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. He let go of the counter, stumbling backward, his chest heaving as he fought to catch his breath. His eyes darted around the diner, and for a moment, I thought he was going to run. But instead, he collapsed. We called 911, but by the time the paramedics arrived, it was too late. The man was dead, his body cold, like he'd been drained of life. They took him away, said it was probably some kind of heart attack or drug overdose, but I knew better. Something was inside him, something that had been feeding on him, eating him alive from the inside out. I went back into the kitchen after the paramedics left, trying to make sense of what had just happened. That's when I noticed the freezer again. The door was open, wider this time, and the smell was back, stronger than ever. I grabbed a knife from the counter, my hands shaking as I approached the freezer. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I had to see. Inside, the raw meat was gone, every last scrap, but there was something else. Something scrawled on the inside of the freezer door in what looked like blood. "It's hungry. We all are." The next few days were a blur. The diner stayed open, customers kept coming in, but the hunger, it didn't stop. More and more people showed up late at night, their eyes glazed over, their bodies trembling with that same desperate need for food. And the freezer, it never stayed shut. No matter how many times I locked it, no matter how many times I cleaned it out, the door would always be open the next time I checked, the smell filling the air, the meat disappearing. I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. Whatever was happening, whatever had gotten into that diner, it wasn't going to stop. It was spreading. On my last night, I left a note for Bobby, the owner, telling him I couldn't work there anymore. I packed up my things, locked the doors, and drove away, leaving the diner behind me. But even now, as I sit here in a different town trying to forget, I can still feel it. That hunger, that insatiable gnawing hunger. And sometimes late at night when everything is quiet, I think I can hear it whispering to me, calling me back. The Collector. My name is Rick, and I've lived in Buffalo, New York my whole life. It's not the worst place to be, but there's a certain loneliness to it, especially in the winter. The snow piles up, burying the streets in white, making the city feel like it's on the edge of the world. I thought I knew this place. I thought I knew myself. Then, I met him. It started with a letter, handwritten, scrawled in ink that had smeared in places. The envelope was tucked into my mailbox between a pizza coupon and a utility bill. I almost missed it. The postmark was local, but there was no return address. Inside, the note was short, cryptic. "I know who you are. Meet me at the place where things grow unwanted. Midnight. Bring nothing." I stared at the words, confused. There was no signature. I'd have dismissed it as a prank, but something about it unsettled me. The phrasing, the tone, the way it felt personal. I crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind kept drifting back to the letter. The place where things grow unwanted. It didn't make sense at first, but then it hit me. The landfill, on the outskirts of town where the city dumped its garbage. I hadn't thought about it in years, but as soon as the idea surfaced, I couldn't shake it. Against my better judgment, I got dressed and headed out. The landfill was worse than I remembered. A mountain of discarded junk and forgotten things, stretching as far as the eye could see. The cold night air bit into my skin as I parked the car, my breath fogging up the windshield. I stepped out, the stench of rotting waste filling my nostrils. I didn't know what I was expecting. Probably nothing. But then I saw him, standing near a heap of rusted metal and broken furniture, just on the edge of the landfill, was a figure. Tall, wearing a long coat that billowed in the wind. He had his back to me, his head bowed like he was waiting for something, or someone. "Hey," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the silence. He didn't move. I approached slowly, my boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. As I got closer, I could see that something was wrong with him. His coat was patched together with scraps of mismatched fabric, and his skin, what little was visible, was pale. Too pale. "Are you the one who sent me the letter?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. He turned then, and I froze. His face, if you could call it that, wasn't human, not entirely. His features were distorted, stretched, as if someone had tried to mold flesh like clay and failed. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and black as coal. His mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin that didn't reach his eyes. "I've been waiting," he rasped, his voice thick, like it hadn't been used in years. I took a step back. "Who are you?" He tilted his head, considering me. "They call me the Collector." "The Collector?" I repeated, not understanding. "What do you want with me?" "You," he said simply. "You're one of them." "One of who?" He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, crumpled photograph. He handed it to me, and as I took it, I felt a strange chill run down my spine. It was a picture of my mother, from when she was young. I'd never seen this photo before, but I knew it was her. She was standing in front of an old house, smiling, her arm around a man I didn't recognize. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "The ones before you," the Collector said. "The ones that made you." I didn't understand. I looked at the photo again, my mind racing. How could he have this? Who was the man with my mother? And why did I feel like something about this picture was wrong? The Collector took a step closer, his grin widening. "They didn't tell you, did they? Didn't tell you what you really are?" I shook my head, backing away. "You're crazy. I don't know what you're talking about." "You will," he whispered. "Soon enough." Suddenly, the air around me felt thick, oppressive. The wind had stopped, and the world seemed to close in on me. I couldn't breathe. I turned and ran, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back. I sped home, the image of the Collector's twisted face burned into my mind. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every sound, every creak of the house made me jump. The photo he'd given me was still in my pocket. I wanted to throw it away, but I couldn't bring myself to. The next morning, I went to see my mother. She was in a care home now, her memory fading more each day. I showed her the picture, hoping for some kind of explanation. Her eyes went wide as soon as she saw it. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Mom, who is this man?" I asked, pointing to the figure next to her. She didn't answer. Instead, she started shaking her head, her hands gripping the edges of her chair. "You shouldn't have come here," she muttered. "I told them not to tell you." I told them. "Told me what?" I demanded, panic rising in my chest. "Who is he?" But she wouldn't speak again. She just stared out the window, lost in some memory I couldn't follow. I left, more confused than ever. Over the next few days, I tried to forget, tried to put it all behind me, but the Collector's words echoed in my head. "They didn't tell you what you are." What did that mean? Who was that man in the photo? Was it my father? Then the letter came again. This time it was just a single word. "Soon. I'm leaving Buffalo tonight. I don't know where I'll go, but I can't stay here. Not with him out there, watching, waiting. Because deep down, I know the truth now. I know that the Collector isn't done with me, and whatever he's collecting, I'm next." The healer. Savannah is known for its charm. The Spanish moss hanging from the trees, the historic homes lining the streets, the endless stretches of marshland that seem to hold secrets from another time. But underneath all of that, there's something darker. Something that people don't talk about. My name is Nathan Lane, and I've been a detective in this city for nearly a decade. I've dealt with drug busts, homicides, robberies, pretty much anything you can imagine. But what happened last month? I still can't explain it. I don't think I ever will. It started with a church. Not one of those grand cathedrals you see in the heart of Savannah, but a small, run-down building on the outskirts of town. It didn't have a sign out front, but the word had been spreading fast. People were talking about a miracle. They said a man had shown up, a preacher who could heal with just his touch, and people were flocking to him by the hundreds. I wouldn't have paid any attention to it if it hadn't been for the deaths. 3 people, all of them found dead in their homes hours after attending the preacher's revival meetings. There were no signs of foul play, no wounds, no trauma. But the cause of death for all 3 was cardiac arrest. The medical examiner couldn't explain it. They were all young, healthy, no history of heart problems. And the weirdest part? They all had the same expression on their faces when they died. Fear. Like they'd seen something terrifying just before their heart stopped. My gut told me it was more than coincidence. I decided to go to the next revival meeting. It was being held in a field behind the church, and when I arrived, there were at least 200 people there. They were gathered around a makeshift stage where the preacher, Elias Fisher, stood, arms raised to the sky, shouting about faith and salvation. He wasn't what I expected. He was young, maybe in his early 30s, with a calm intensity that seemed to draw people in. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried, like it was meant just for you. I kept to the back of the crowd watching as Fisher spoke about miracles, about how God had chosen him to heal the sick and save the lost. The crowd was hanging on every word. People were crying, shouting, reaching out toward him like he was their only hope. And then he started calling people up to the stage. The first was a woman in a wheelchair. She'd been paralyzed from the waist down for years, according to the whispers I heard around me. Fisher placed his hands on her shoulders, his eyes closing as he whispered a prayer. And then, against all logic, she stood up. The crowd erupted in cheers, people falling to their knees, praising God for the miracle they'd just witnessed. I was stunned, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The whole thing felt off, staged almost. But the woman's tears, her sobs of gratitude, they were real. She believed. I stuck around after the meeting, blending in with the crowd as people lined up to meet Fisher. Some were there for healing, others just to touch him, like his very presence would bless their lives. I kept my distance, watching as Fisher moved through the crowd, laying hands on people, whispering prayers. But then something strange happened. One man, an older guy in his 50s, approached Fisher, but instead of asking for healing, he seemed angry. I couldn't hear their conversation from where I stood, but the man's face was flushed, his fists clenched at his sides. He was accusing Fisher of something. Fisher didn't flinch. He just placed his hand on the man's chest, right over his heart, and whispered something. The man's anger seemed to melt away instantly, his eyes going wide with shock. He stumbled back, his hand clutching his chest, and before anyone could react, he collapsed to the ground. Dead. The crowd went silent. Fisher knelt beside the man, placing his hand over the man's heart again, but it was too late. People began murmuring, a mix of confusion and fear spreading through the crowd. That's when Fisher stood up, his voice calm and steady as he addressed the crowd. God gives and God takes away, he said. This man was called home. The crowd accepted it. They moved on as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd just witnessed wasn't a miracle. It was something far darker. I started digging into Fisher's past the next day. He wasn't from Savannah. He'd only arrived in town a few months ago, traveling from small town to small town, performing his so-called miracles. But everywhere he went, people died. Not many, just a few here and there, but always under the same mysterious circumstances. Heart failure. No explanation. The deeper I dug, the more uneasy I became. Fisher had no official records, no birth certificate, no social security number, no history before he started preaching. It was like he'd appeared out of nowhere. I knew I needed to confront him, but I couldn't just walk in and start asking questions. I needed to see more, to understand how he was doing it. So I went to another revival meeting, this time sitting closer, watching his every move. That night, something happened that I still can't explain. Fisher was healing again, calling people up one by one. But as he placed his hands on a man's head, I saw something. Something I wouldn't have believed if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. For a brief moment, as his hand touched the man, there was a flicker of light, like a faint pulse of energy radiating from Fisher's fingertips. The man's face contorted in pain just for a second, before he collapsed to the ground, writhing in agony. Fisher stepped back, his expression calm as if he'd expected it. The crowd rushed forward, but Fisher held up his hand, stopping them. "He's being cleansed," Fisher said, his voice ringing out over the murmurs. "The power of God is working through him." But it wasn't right. The man wasn't being healed. He was suffering. I could see it in his eyes, the same fear I'd seen in the faces of the dead. Before I could do anything, the man's body went still. Fisher turned to the crowd, raising his arms. "God has chosen to take this man. He is with the Lord now." I couldn't let it go any longer. After the meeting, I approached Fisher, my hand resting on the gun holstered at my side. "We need to talk," I said, keeping my voice steady. Fisher smiled as if he'd been expecting me. "Detective Lane," he said softly, "I wondered when you'd come." I didn't respond. "What are you doing to these people?" Fisher tilted his head, his eyes gleaming with something I couldn't place, something cold, detached. "I'm giving them what they want, what they need." "People are dying," I said, my hand tightening around the grip of my gun. "That's not healing. That's murder." Fisher stepped closer, his voice low. "Death is just another form of salvation. I don't take their lives, detective. I release them." I didn't know what to say. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a growing sense of dread crawling up my spine. "You don't understand," Fisher continued, his voice almost a whisper. "This isn't about miracles. It's about power. The power to give, and the power to take away." Before I could react, Fisher reached out and placed his hand on my chest. A wave of cold washed over me, and for a moment, I couldn't move. My heart skipped a beat, then another, the air growing thick and suffocating. And then, just as quickly as it started, the pressure lifted. Fisher smiled and stepped back. "Be careful, detective. Some truths are better left buried." I haven't been back to another revival meeting since that night. Fisher left Savannah soon after, moving on to the next town, leaving behind more questions than answers. The death stopped, and life in Savannah went back to normal. But I can't shake the feeling that he'll be back, that there are more like him out there, people who wield power that none of us can understand. And sometimes I still feel that cold touch on my chest, like a reminder of what I saw that night. A reminder that some miracles come at a price. The Hollow Men. You know those stories people tell about sleepwalking? About waking up in strange places, unsure of how they got there? That's what I thought was happening to me at first. My name is Daniel Finch, and I'm an accountant from Boise, Idaho. Not exactly the most exciting life I know, but it's stable, safe. Or it was, until the dreams started. At first they were small, fleeting images. I'd wake up with fragments in my mind. A forest at night, the glow of the moon filtering through tall trees. I'd shake it off, thinking it was just stress. After all, numbers can drive anyone crazy after staring at them long enough. But then the dreams became more vivid. I was always in the same place, standing in a dark forest, the trees so thick that the moonlight barely penetrated. There was a path ahead of me, winding deeper into the woods, and I felt like I had to follow it. I didn't know why, but the pull was undeniable. The strange thing was I could feel the dream, the cold air biting at my skin, the crunch of dead leaves under my feet. It wasn't like a normal dream. It felt real. Too real. Every night I'd walk further down the path, each step taking me deeper into the forest. And every night I'd wake up in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I told myself it was nothing, just a recurring nightmare. But then I started waking up in strange places. The first time, it was my backyard. I found myself standing outside in the middle of the night, barefoot, staring at the woods that bordered my property. I couldn't remember getting out of bed. The second time, it was worse. I woke up at a park across town, lying on a bench with no memory of how I'd gotten there. I was scared, really scared. Sleepwalking, I figured. That had to be it. But the dreams didn't stop. Every night I'd walk deeper into the forest, the path getting narrower, the trees closing in. I began to hear whispers, faint, indistinct voices that seemed to come from the shadows. They weren't words I could understand, but I knew they were calling to me, urging me forward. Then one night everything changed. In the dream I reached a clearing. The trees parted, revealing an open space bathed in pale moonlight. In the center of the clearing was a large stone, covered in strange carvings. It looked ancient, weathered by time, and something about it made my stomach turn. That's when I saw them. Figures standing around the stone. Tall, thin, and cloaked in shadow. Their faces were hidden, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold, unblinking. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just watched. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was frozen, rooted to the spot, as the figures slowly turned toward me. One of them stepped forward, its movement smooth and unnatural. As it came closer, I could see its face, or what should have been its face. There was nothing there. Just a hollow space where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. I woke up screaming, drenched in cold sweat. But this time I wasn't in my bed, I was in the woods. The same woods from my dream. The cold air stung my skin, and the ground beneath me was covered in leaves and dirt. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding as I realized I was standing on the same path I had walked in the dream, the same path that led to the clearing. I ran. I don't know how I found my way out of the woods, but I ran until I saw the lights of the city in the distance. My legs were shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps by the time I made it back to my house. I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the floor, my mind racing. How had I gotten there? Had I walked in my sleep again, or was it something else? I didn't sleep the next night or the night after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel them. The hollow men, watching, waiting. The dreams never returned, but the feeling of being pulled toward the woods never left. I went back to the woods the next day. I had to know if it was real, if the place I had seen in my dream actually existed. I followed the same path, my heart in my throat as the trees thickened around me. I walked for what felt like hours, but I never found the clearing. But I did find something else. In the underbrush, half hidden by leaves and dirt, I found an old, weathered jacket. It looked like it had been there for years, forgotten and abandoned. And beneath it, buried in the soil, I found something worse, a bone, human. I backed away, my stomach churning. I didn't need to dig further to know what I had found. I called the police. They came out, cordoned off the area, and started an investigation. But they didn't find what I had seen in my dream. No clearing, no stone, no hollow men. But they did find more bones. That was a week ago. The authorities have been tight-lipped about the investigation, but I've heard rumors. The remains they found were old, decades old. And there were more than a few bodies. The woods had become a graveyard, and no one had known. Or maybe no one had wanted to know. I haven't slept since. Every time I close my eyes, I feel like I'm back in that clearing, surrounded by the hollow men, their empty faces watching me. I've tried to move on, to pretend it was just a dream, but I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. They're still out there, the hollow men, and they're waiting for me to come back. The night they never sleep. I didn't want to believe that what was happening was real. I'm a detective, after all. We deal in facts, not fantasies. But sometimes the lines blur, and I learned that the hard way last month. My name's Rick Tannen, and I've been with the Spokane Police Department for nearly a decade. I've worked my share of tough cases, seen enough blood to last a lifetime. But nothing compares to what I'm about to tell you. It started with a fire. A 3-story building downtown, one of those old structures that had been converted into cheap apartments. The kind of place where you mind your own business and hope no one bothers you. By the time I arrived on the scene, the building was a smoldering ruin. Firefighters had doused the flames, but the damage was already done. There were bodies, 3 of them. They were all burned beyond recognition. But the coroner found something strange. Each of the victims had signs of extensive exhaustion. Not just regular tiredness, extreme sleep deprivation. Their eyes were sunken, their skin leathery, their muscles twitching even after death. That stuck with me. I'd seen the effects of stress, insomnia, and long nights before, but nothing like this. It was like these people had been awake for weeks. I would have chalked it up to a random fire, an electrical issue, something normal, but then we got the second call. This time, at a small house on the edge of town. Same situation. Another fire, more bodies, more signs of severe sleep deprivation. I couldn't ignore the pattern. People don't just stay awake for days on end and suddenly burn alive in their own homes. So I started digging. The first fire victims had been connected. Roommates, all working night shifts at a local factory. The second set of victims, a married couple, both worked as security guards, often pulling late-night shifts. I started to wonder if something was keeping these people awake, something beyond their control. But there was no evidence of drugs or any external factors. Then we got a third call. This time, the victim survived, barely. His name was Adam Hodge, and when I found him, he was in a panic. His house hadn't burned down yet, but smoke was starting to billow from the basement when the fire department arrived. They pulled him out just in time. Adam was a mess. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Dark circles under his eyes, his body twitching uncontrollably. He couldn't stop shaking. The paramedics loaded him into the ambulance, and I followed, knowing he might be the key to figuring out what was going on. At the hospital, I sat beside his bed, waiting for him to regain consciousness. It didn't take long. When his eyes finally opened, he looked at me with wild, frantic energy. "They're coming for me," he whispered. I leaned in closer, trying to keep my voice calm. "Who's coming for you, Adam?" "They never sleep," he muttered, his voice shaky. "They're always awake. They watch me, every night. Every time I close my eyes, I see them." "Who are they?" I asked, feeling a cold chill settle in the pit of my stomach. He didn't answer. Instead, his eyes darted toward the window like he expected someone, something, to be watching us. "I haven't slept in 6 days," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I tried, but they won't let me." That night, Adam disappeared. The hospital room was empty when I arrived the next morning. No sign of a struggle, no broken windows, no forced doors. He was just gone. That's when the dream started. I hadn't thought much about it at first, just the usual nightmares, the kind that come with stress. But each night they grew more vivid. I'd lie in bed, unable to sleep, feeling something pressing down on my chest. In my dreams, I'd see figures, shadowy, formless beings standing just out of reach, their eyes wide open, staring at me, watching. Always watching. Every time I'd drift off, they'd be there, pulling me deeper into the darkness. I'd wake up gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. And every night, it got worse. I started losing track of time. I'd go days without sleeping, unable to focus, unable to think. I'd find myself walking through the city at night, unsure of how I got there. But the worst part was the feeling that I wasn't alone. I could feel them, watching. One night, after another restless bout of pacing my apartment, I decided to visit Adam's house. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I felt like I had to go there, like something was pulling me toward it. The place was a wreck. The fire had damaged most of the basement, but there were still a few untouched areas. As I walked through the charred remains, I noticed something strange. A pile of notebooks stacked in the corner, each one filled with scrawled handwriting. I flipped through the pages, my heart racing. They were Adam's journals, and they were filled with frantic notes about staying awake, about the figures that watched him in the night. But it wasn't just fear in his writing. There was something more, something darker. They live in the spaces between. One entry read, "They feed off the mind. They wait until you're weak, and then they come for you." Another entry, "I see them everywhere now. They follow me even in the daylight. I can't sleep. If I sleep, they'll take me." I felt a shiver run down my spine. The last entry was dated the night before I found him. "They've found me. They never sleep. Neither will I." As I stood in the basement, the air grew thick, heavy with something I couldn't explain. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, to move, even though there was no wind. I could feel them, watching me. I stumbled out of the house, my mind racing, my body trembling with exhaustion. I hadn't slept in days, and the weight of it was dragging me down. I could barely keep my eyes open, but I knew I couldn't sleep. Not now. Not ever. As I drove home, the figures followed me. I saw them in the rearview mirror, standing on the side of the road, staring. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, were burned into my mind. I'm writing this now because I don't know how much longer I can stay awake. It's been 6 days. 6 days without sleep. The figures are everywhere. I see them in the shadows, in the corners of my vision. They're always watching, waiting. I don't know what they are, but I know what they want. They want me to sleep. They want to take me, just like they took Adam. I can't let that happen. I have to stay awake, but I don't know how much longer I can hold on. The lights on Devil's Ridge. The Smoky Mountains always had a way of swallowing the light. That's what I thought the first time I saw the ridge. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting a deep purple hue over the landscape. But the ridge, the one the locals called Devil's Ridge, looked different. It was darker, as if the light had never reached it in the first place. I'm Owen Brady, a park ranger, and I've spent the better part of 5 years patrolling these mountains. I know every trail, every tree, every stream that cuts through the dense forest. But I wasn't ready for what I found on Devil's Ridge. It all started with a hiker who went missing, David Malik, 28, an experienced outdoorsman who had hiked these trails more times than I could count. When his fiancée reported him missing, I was the one tasked with leading the search. We found his car parked near one of the more secluded trailheads, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had vanished into thin air. That was 3 days ago. By the 4th day, the team was ready to call off the search. There was a storm rolling in and conditions were getting worse. But something kept nagging at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something we were missing, something we hadn't seen yet. So I decided to go out one last time, just me. I followed the path up toward Devil's Ridge. The locals had their stories about it. Old legends about people disappearing up there, strange lights in the sky. I always dismissed them as the usual backwoods superstitions. But as I hiked through the thick trees, the air heavy with the promise of rain, I started to wonder if maybe there was something to those stories after all. It took me the better part of the afternoon to reach the ridge. The trail was narrow and overgrown, like no one had walked it in years. When I finally reached the top, the wind had picked up, howling through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and wet earth. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, something glinting in the distance. But as I walked closer, I realized it was something more. There, in the clearing at the edge of the ridge, was a strange metallic object, half buried in the ground, surrounded by scorched earth. I crouched down, running my fingers over the smooth, cold surface. It was too big to be a piece of scrap metal, too clean to have been sitting here for long, and yet it looked like it had been here for decades. That's when I noticed the lights. They were faint at first, just small, blinking orbs hovering above the ridge. But as I watched, they began to move, darting through the trees like fireflies. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I had seen strange things in the woods before, but nothing like this. I stood up, scanning the tree line, and that's when I saw him, David Malik. He was standing just beyond the clearing, his back to me, staring up at the sky. I called out his name, but he didn't respond. I started toward him, my boots crunching on the dry leaves, but the closer I got, the more I realized something was wrong. David wasn't moving. He was frozen, his arms hanging limply at his sides, his head tilted back in an unnatural angle. I called his name again, louder this time, but he didn't so much as twitch. The lights overhead flickered, and for a moment everything went still. The wind died, the forest fell silent, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Then David turned around. His eyes were wide, unblinking, his face pale and gaunt, like he hadn't eaten in days. But it wasn't just the look of him that sent a chill down my spine. It was the way he moved, slow, jerky, like a puppet on strings. He took a step toward me, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. "David?" I whispered, unsure of what I was seeing. He took another step, his eyes fixed on me, empty and hollow. The lights above us pulsed, brighter now, casting long shadows across the clearing. And then he spoke, but it wasn't his voice. "Leave," he said, the word low and distorted, like it was being forced out of him. "Leave now." I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. "David, what happened? Where have you been?" He didn't answer. Instead, his head twitched to the side, his body convulsing as if something was controlling him. The lights overhead pulsed again, and I could feel the air around me grow thick, charged with static. "Leave," he said again, his voice more urgent this time. "They're coming." That was all I needed to hear. I turned and bolted, my feet pounding against the dirt as I sprinted back down the trail. The wind roared through the trees, and I could hear the sound of branches snapping behind me as if something was chasing me, something I couldn't see. But I didn't dare look back. When I finally made it back to the base of the ridge, I collapsed against a tree, my chest heaving. The lights were gone, and the forest had returned to its usual eerie silence. I radioed for help, but when the rest of the team arrived, there was no sign of David. No sign of the metallic object, no sign of the lights. It was as if none of it had ever happened. But I know what I saw. David Malik was never found. His case remains open, another name added to the list of missing hikers swallowed up by the Smoky Mountains. The official story is that he got lost in the woods, succumbed to the elements. But I know the truth. There's something on Devil's Ridge, something ancient, something that watches from the shadows, and whatever it is, it's not done yet. The silent stare. There's something about the eyes, the way they can look straight through you, like they're seeing something deeper than what's right in front of them. I've learned to trust that feeling, the sense that someone's hiding something they don't want you to see. But in this case, the eyes were the first clue that something was horribly wrong. My name is Eli Barrett, and I'm a detective with the Wichita Police Department. I've handled plenty of difficult cases over the years, but nothing like this. Nothing that makes you question what's real and what's something else. It all started with a missing person. Hannah Cruz, a 25-year-old nursing student, disappeared on her way home from her night shift at the hospital. Her car was found abandoned on the side of the road just outside the city. The driver's side door left wide open, her purse and phone still inside. At first, we thought it might be a carjacking or a kidnapping, but there was no sign of a struggle. It was like she'd stepped out of the car and simply vanished. But there was something else, something that sent chills down my spine. Taped to the steering wheel was a photograph, a Polaroid. It was of Hannah, bound and gagged, her eyes wide open, staring directly at the camera. The terror in her expression was unmistakable. The problem was the picture looked off. The angles didn't make sense, and the background was blurred, almost distorted, like a bad dream captured on film. We ran the photo through every test we had, but nothing about it added up. It was real, but at the same time, it wasn't. The next day, we got another one. This time, the victim was Clint Miller, a local electrician. He'd been found in his own home, tied to a chair in his living room, unconscious but alive. Like with Hannah, a Polaroid had been left behind. This one showing Clint in the same position we found him, his eyes wide with fear, his expression frozen in shock. But here's the thing. Clint had no memory of how he got there. He said he'd been working on some wiring in the basement when everything went black. The next thing he knew, he was waking up in the chair, the photo lying on the floor next to him. The photo showed him exactly as we found him, down to the last detail. But it had been taken hours before we even arrived. At this point, I knew something was seriously wrong. Two people, both taken and photographed in some kind of twisted setup, both with no memory of what had happened. And those eyes, those terrified, wide-open eyes that seemed to stare straight into the lens, pleading for help. I started digging through old cases, looking for anything similar. That's when I found it. 10 years ago, there had been a string of disappearances across the Midwest. Same MO people vanishing without a trace, only to reappear days later, disoriented and traumatized. Polaroid photos had been left behind in every case, each showing the victim in a state of terror, their eyes wide open, staring into the camera. The man responsible had been caught, Alan Shepard, a former psychiatric patient with a history of violent outbursts. He had claimed that he could see things in the photos, visions of people's deepest fears, their darkest thoughts. The courts dismissed it as insanity, and Shepard was sentenced to life in a maximum security facility. So how was it happening again? I paid a visit to Shepard at the state hospital. He was older now, his once menacing presence reduced to a shell of a man. His eyes were vacant, staring off into the distance as I sat down across from him. "I know why you're here," he said, his voice raspy. "You think I'm doing it again, don't you?" I didn't answer right away, but I could feel the tension in the room. There have been 2 new victims, Shepard. Same MO, same photos. How is that possible if you're in here? He smiled, a slow, unsettling grin. "It's not about where I am. It's about what I see. What I can make others see." I leaned forward, my heart pounding. "What do you mean?" Shepard's eyes flickered with a strange light as he leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "The eyes, detective. It's always in the eyes. People think they see the world, but they don't. Not really. I show them what's underneath, what they're afraid to look at." I shook my head, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "You're not making any sense, Shepard. These people, how are they being targeted?" He leaned back in his chair, chuckling to himself. "You'll see. When it's your turn, you'll see." I left the hospital more confused than ever. Shepard was locked away. There was no way he could be physically involved. But the look in his eyes, the certainty in his voice, told me that somehow he knew what was happening. Somehow he was connected to it. The next day, we got another Polaroid. This time it was left in my office. The photo was of me sitting at my desk looking down at a case file. My eyes were wide open, just like the others, staring, unblinking. But here's the thing. I didn't remember the moment the photo was taken. I had no recollection of being in that position. And yet, there it was, proof that I had been. And just like with the other photos, the background was distorted, the edges of the picture warped like something was bleeding into the image from somewhere else. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those Polaroids, the terrified faces, the wide-open eyes. I started to feel like someone was watching me, like I was being followed by something I couldn't see. The shadows in my apartment seemed to stretch longer, and the silence felt too heavy, like it was waiting for something. I knew I was losing it. I'd seen enough trauma on the job to recognize when my mind was playing tricks on me, but this was different. This felt real. Around 2 a.m., I heard the click of a camera. I shot up from my bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and looked around the room. There was no one there, but the sound had been so clear, so precise, I couldn't shake it. I got up, checking the windows and doors, but everything was locked. Then I saw it. A Polaroid lying on the floor by the foot of my bed. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and stared at the image. It was me, lying in bed, my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. But the photo had been taken from above, like someone had been standing over me, watching me sleep. The next few days were a blur. I tried to push through to keep working on the case, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on me. The photos kept coming. More Polaroids, each one showing me in a different place, a different moment, but always with the same haunting expression. I couldn't trust anyone, not even myself. I started to wonder if Shepard was right, if there was something in the eyes, something I wasn't seeing. It wasn't long before they found me. I was sitting in my car parked outside the police station when I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I looked in the rearview mirror, and there, staring back at me, was my own reflection. But it wasn't me. My reflection's eyes were wide open, its mouth twisted into a silent scream. And behind me, in the darkness, I saw the faint outline of a figure, standing just out of sight, holding a camera. The last thing I remember is the flash of the camera, blindingly bright, and then nothing. They found me a few hours later, unconscious in my car. No one could explain what had happened. The doctor said I must have had some kind of breakdown, that the stress of the case had finally caught up to me. But I know the truth. I've seen the photos, I've seen what's underneath, and now I can't unsee it. The Vanishing Lights. I didn't believe in UFOs or any of that conspiracy nonsense. I was a trucker, not some wide-eyed kid hoping for a glimpse of something strange in the sky. My life was spent on the highway, moving freight from one end of the country to the other. But that all changed one night outside of Roswell, New Mexico. It was a routine haul, just a load of steel heading east from California. I'd driven this route a dozen times before, passing through the desert late at night when the roads were empty. The night was pitch black, the kind of darkness you only get in the middle of nowhere, far from city lights. Just me, my rig, and the open road. It must have been close to 2 a.m. when I saw the lights. At first, I thought it was a plane. There was an air base nearby, and it wasn't uncommon to see jets or helicopters on night exercises. But this was different. The lights were low, hovering just above the horizon, and they were moving erratically. Too fast for any plane, too sharp in their turns for any helicopter. I slowed the truck, leaning forward to get a better look. The lights were bright, a strange, pulsating glow that seemed to flicker in and out. There were 3 of them, perfectly spaced, moving together in a pattern that made no sense. They weren't following any flight path I'd ever seen. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled the rig onto the side of the road, killing the engine and stepping out into the cold desert air. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the truck cooling down. I watched as the lights moved closer, my heart thudding in my chest. That's when I noticed it. Everything was dead silent. No wind, no insects, no distant sounds of trucks or cars. Just nothing. The lights moved in closer, almost hovering directly over the road about a mile ahead of me. And then they stopped. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I got back in the truck and started driving toward them. The closer I got, the more I felt something off. My arms were tingling, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. It was like the air itself had changed. Thick, electric. When I was about 100 yards away, my headlights flickered, first dimming, then cutting out entirely. The truck's dashboard lights followed suit, and suddenly I was in complete darkness, the engine sputtering out beneath me. I coasted to a stop, the silence pressing in again. My hands gripped the steering wheel, sweat slicking my palms. And then I saw them. Figures moving beneath the lights. Shadowy, indistinct shapes. At least 5 of them, walking slowly, as if they were searching for something, or someone. They were too far away to make out any details, but I could see enough to know they weren't human. Their movements were too fluid, too graceful, and they didn't seem to walk so much as glide over the desert sand. I should have left right then and there, should have thrown the truck in reverse and never looked back. But I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, staring at those figures as they moved in and out of the light. One of them turned, as if sensing me. It looked straight at the truck, and even from that distance I could feel its eyes on me. Cold. Unfeeling. Suddenly, there was a bright flash of light, so intense it blinded me. I threw my hands up, shielding my eyes, but the light was everywhere, like the sun had exploded in the middle of the night. A loud hum filled the air, vibrating through the truck, through my bones, until it felt like my whole body was shaking apart. Then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The lights were gone. The figures were gone. The hum was gone. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to process what had just happened. The truck's lights flickered back on, the engine roaring to life as if nothing had happened. I slammed the gas, pulling the rig into a hard U-turn and speeding back down the highway. I didn't care where I was headed, as long as it was away from there. The next morning, I stopped at a diner in Roswell. I hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, but I needed to clear my head. The waitress poured me a cup of coffee, and as she placed it on the table, she glanced at me like she recognized something in my face. "You see the lights, didn't you?" she asked, her voice low. I froze, the coffee cup halfway to my mouth. "What lights?" She gave me a knowing smile. "The lights out by the old base. You're not the first to come in here looking spooked after driving that stretch of road." "What are they?" Her smile faded. She glanced around the diner as if checking to see who might be listening. "No one knows for sure. Some say it's government experiments. Others say it's visitors." "Visitors?" "From up there," she said, pointing a finger toward the ceiling. "Folks who see them, they never come back quite the same." I didn't say anything, just sat there staring at my coffee as it grew cold. I left town that day, back on the road, but something's been wrong ever since. It's not just the nightmares, though they're bad enough. It's the feeling that I'm being watched, that whatever I saw out there wasn't done with me. 2 weeks after that night, I noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. A black car, same make, same model, always a few miles back, but it's there. Every trip, every route, every stop. It's following me. I've tried to lose it, taken back roads, switched motels at the last minute, but no matter what I do, that car shows up. It's always just far enough that I can't see who's driving, but close enough that I know they're watching. I don't know what happened that night in the desert. I don't know what I saw or what those figures were, but I know one thing for sure. They haven't forgotten me, and they're not going to let me go. The quiet ones. I've always hated the heat. Growing up in Phoenix, Arizona, you'd think I'd be used to it by now, but every summer feels like a punishment. The sun beats down on you like it's trying to smother you. The air dry enough to crack your skin. I thought it couldn't get any worse. My name's Tom Fletcher. I've been a journalist for the Phoenix Chronicle for the better part of 10 years. Usually I cover local politics, city developments, stuff that doesn't make it past the front page of the community section. But about 2 weeks ago, I got a tip about something strange happening in the outskirts of the city, near a small farming community called Blackwater. People were dying out there, but not from anything you'd expect. Not dehydration, not heat stroke, something else. The first case was a migrant worker. A man in his mid-30s found dead in the fields with his skin blistered and covered in strange lesions, like he'd been burned from the inside out. The local authorities chalked it up to a freak accident, something to do with pesticides, but the people in Blackwater weren't convinced. And then, it happened again, and again. By the time I got out there, 3 people were dead, all of them with the same grotesque burns on their bodies. The authorities were tight-lipped, which is why I decided to go down there myself and see what was really happening. I arrived in Blackwater just after noon, the sun high in the sky, casting long shadows over the small cluster of houses and farms. The place was quiet. Too quiet. A handful of people lingered outside, their faces pale and drawn, whispering to one another. It didn't take long before I was pointed to a man named Javier, a farm owner whose brother had been one of the first victims. Javier lived in a small rundown house at the edge of his property. When I knocked, he answered the door cautiously, his eyes red and puffy from lack of sleep. "You the reporter?" he asked, his voice rough. "That's right. I just want to ask a few questions about what's been happening here," I said, trying to sound reassuring. Javier hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let me in. The house smelled of stale air and anxiety. He led me to a small kitchen table where a cup of cold coffee sat, forgotten. "You're wasting your time," he said, sitting down heavily in the chair opposite me. "Ain't nobody gonna believe what's happening out here." "Try me," I said, pulling out a notepad. "I've heard rumors, but I need to know the truth." Javier stared at the table for a long moment before speaking. "It's not the heat. It's them." "Them?" I asked, leaning in. He looked up at me, his eyes haunted. "The quiet ones. That's what we call them. They come when the sun is at its hottest, when everything's still. You don't hear them, don't see them, until it's too late." I frowned. "What do you mean by quiet ones? People? Animals?" Javier shook his head. "No, not people. Something else. They look like us, but they're not human. They move through the air like shadows, invisible until they want you to see them. And when they touch you, the heat, it burns you alive." A chill ran down my spine despite the oppressive heat outside. "And you've seen these things?" "I've seen what they do," Javier said, his voice low. "My brother, he was one of the first. Found him in the fields. His skin burned off in places like he'd been set on fire from the inside. No flames, no sign of a struggle. Just gone." I sat back, trying to make sense of it. People dying from burns without any fire, strange figures that could appear and disappear at will. It sounded like something out of a horror movie. But the look in Javier's eyes told me he believed every word. "Why hasn't anyone done anything about it?" I asked. "The police, the city. Someone has to know what's going on." "They know," he said bitterly, "but they won't do a damn thing. They're scared. They don't understand what's happening and they don't want to. Easier to pretend it's just bad luck, that it's the heat. But we know better. We've always known." That night I decided to stay in Blackwater. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I had to see it for myself. Javier offered to let me stay in his guest room, and I accepted. The house was stifling, the air thick with tension. I could tell Javier didn't expect me to last the night. As the sun set, the temperature dropped slightly, but the silence grew heavier. It was the kind of quiet that pressed down on you, making the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I lay in bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, waiting. Sometime around midnight, I heard it, a faint rustling outside, like dry leaves skittering across the ground. I got up, heart pounding, and looked out the window. The fields were empty, bathed in the pale light of the moon. But something felt wrong. The air had changed, like it was charged with electricity. I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside, making my way through the rows of crops. The rustling grew louder, more insistent, but I couldn't see anything. My breath quickened as I swept the beam of light back and forth, searching for the source of the sound. Then, I saw them. Figures moving through the field. At first I thought they were people, but something was off. They moved too quickly, too fluidly, like shadows slipping between the stalks of corn. And their eyes. When they turned toward me, their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, cold and empty. I backed away, heart racing. The temperature around me spiked, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. The air was scorching, the heat so intense it felt like my skin was blistering. I stumbled, my flashlight flickering as the figures moved closer, their forms shifting, growing taller, darker. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the house, but when I slammed the door behind me, I was shaking, drenched in sweat. Javier was waiting for me in the living room, his face pale. "You saw them," he said quietly. I nodded, too terrified to speak. "They'll be back," he warned. "They always come back." I left Blackwater the next morning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I tried to write about what I saw, tried to warn people, but no one believed me. The deaths were swept under the rug, blamed on freak accidents or the heat wave. But I know the truth. The quiet ones are still out there, waiting for the hottest days, when the air is still and the sky is clear. They move like shadows, invisible until they want to be seen. And when they touch you, the heat will burn you alive. The surgeon's hands. It's funny how you get used to things in the medical field. Blood, broken bones, the dull thud of a heart monitor flatlining. After a while, it all starts to blur together. You see so much, you start to lose touch with what's normal and what isn't. But I never got used to what happened that night. I don't think I ever will. My name is Dr. Matt Barnes, and I'm a surgeon at Lakeshore Medical Center in Cleveland. I've been in the game for years, long enough to know that not every patient makes it, no matter how good you are or how hard you try. But for the past month, things had been different. Patients weren't just dying, they were being butchered. It started with small mistakes, procedures that went wrong, accidents in the OR that no one could explain. A healthy patient would come in for routine surgery and something would happen. They'd bleed out unexpectedly, or their organs would be damaged in ways that made no sense. At first, we thought it was just bad luck. It happens. Surgery is never without risks. But when the deaths kept piling up, I started paying attention. It wasn't just bad luck. It was something more. The first time I saw it happen was during a routine appendectomy. I was assisting Dr. Alan Rivers, one of the top surgeons at Lakeshore. The guy was practically a legend. Steady hands, always in control. The patient was a 23-year-old woman, perfectly healthy except for a nagging appendix that had to come out. Everything was going smoothly. Rivers had the appendix in his hands, about to remove it when something changed. His hands started shaking just a little at first. I thought it was fatigue, but then they started trembling violently, like he couldn't control them. "Alan," I whispered, trying not to alarm the rest of the team. "You okay?" He didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the patient, but it was like he wasn't seeing her anymore. His hands jerked, and before I could stop him, he plunged the scalpel into the patient's abdomen, over and over again, like he was in some kind of trance. "Alan, stop!" I shouted, grabbing his wrists, but it was too late. Blood sprayed across the sterile white of the operating room. The monitors went haywire as the patient's heart rate flatlined. I pulled him away, but he just stood there staring at his blood-covered hands, his face pale as a ghost. "I didn't mean to. I couldn't stop," he whispered. "We lost her. A perfectly healthy young woman, dead on the table, and I had no idea why." Rivers was suspended after that, pending an investigation. But he wasn't the only one. A few days later, another surgeon, Dr. Kate Melville, lost control during a routine heart surgery. Same thing, shaking hands, eyes glazed over like something else was driving her. The patient didn't make it. People were starting to talk, rumors spreading through the hospital like wildfire. Some said it was stress. Others thought it was some kind of neurological condition affecting the surgeons. But I knew it wasn't that. It was something darker. One night after another patient death, I was in the locker room changing out of my scrubs when Rivers walked in. He looked awful, gaunt, his eyes bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in days. "You still think about it?" he asked, sitting down on the bench beside me. "Think about what?" "The feeling," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "When it happened, it wasn't me, Matt. It was like something else was in control, something using me." I looked at him, not sure what to say. "Alan, you just need to rest. We've all been under a lot of pressure lately." He shook his head. "No, it's not stress. It's not me. It's this place." He paused, his hands trembling again. "The operating room. There's something in there." I didn't know what to say, but his words stuck with me. The way he described it, it wasn't just an accident. It was like something had taken over him, forcing him to do things he didn't want to do. A week later, I found myself back in the OR, prepping for surgery. The patient was a middle-aged man, in for a simple gallbladder removal. It should have been routine. But the moment I picked up the scalpel, I felt it. A tingling in my fingers, like an electrical current running through my hands. My grip tightened involuntarily and I froze. The same tremor I'd seen in Rivers and Melville was creeping into my hands, the scalpel shaking in my grip. I tried to focus, to push through it, but the shaking got worse. My mind was screaming at me to stop, but my body wasn't listening. I raised the scalpel, my heart pounding in my chest, and then I heard the whisper. It was faint, just below the hum of the machines, like someone was standing behind me, murmuring in my ear. The words were garbled, impossible to understand, but the intent was clear. It was telling me to cut, to kill. I fought against it, my hands trembling violently as I tried to control them. The room spun around me, the lights too bright, the sound of the monitors growing louder and louder. I could feel the scalpel pressing down on the patient's skin, just a fraction away from making the first incision when I finally snapped out of it. With all the strength I had, I dropped the scalpel, stepping back from the table. The operating room fell silent. I called off the surgery, claiming fatigue, but I knew what had happened. The same thing that had taken over Rivers and Melville had tried to take me too. I couldn't explain it, but I knew the hospital was hiding something. Something that was infecting the surgeons, making them do things they'd never do on their own. That night I went to the hospital records room, digging through old files, looking for anything that could explain what was happening. That's when I found it. Years ago, before the hospital was built, the land it stood on had been home to an old surgical facility, a place where experimental procedures had been conducted. The facility had been shut down after a series of mysterious deaths. Surgeons had reported hearing voices, feeling compelled to perform horrific surgeries on their patients. The records were incomplete, but there was one name that kept coming up: Dr. Isaac Porter, the head surgeon of the old facility. According to the reports, Porter had become obsessed with his work, convinced that he could perfect the human body through surgery. He had performed dozens of unauthorized operations before he was finally stopped, killed in a fire that had destroyed the facility. But something told me that Porter wasn't gone, not completely. The next day I went to the OR where the incidents had occurred. I stood in the middle of the room, staring at the walls, the equipment, the sterile lights overhead. Everything was in its place, perfectly normal, but I could feel it, the presence. It was there, lurking just below the surface, waiting for the next victim. I closed my eyes and listened, and there it was. The whisper. It wasn't just in my head. It was real, seeping through the walls, through the machines, through the very air of the hospital. A voice from the past, still trying to continue its work, still trying to cut. I left the hospital that day and never came back. I knew I couldn't stay there, not with whatever was inside that place, whatever had taken over the surgeons. I don't know if it was Dr. Porter's spirit or something worse, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. Now, every time I see a scalpel, Every time I hear the faint hum of hospital machines, I think about that whisper. I think about the hands that almost weren't my own. And I wonder if it's still there, waiting for the next surgeon to pick up the blade. The swarm. I never thought I'd end up working for the Phoenix Pest Control Department, but life has a way of taking you to unexpected places. What was supposed to be a temporary job became a permanent one after a few months. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. And in a city like Phoenix, pests were a constant problem. From scorpions to termites, I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing prepared me for what I found out near the old industrial district last summer. My name is Dean Turner, and I'm an exterminator. I've been in the business long enough to know that no infestation is ever as simple as it seems. But the one that started on August 12th? That was something else. It was a blistering hot afternoon when I got the call. A woman named Janice Pruitt reported what she described as a serious insect problem at a small warehouse on the outskirts of Phoenix. The place had been abandoned for years, but recently someone had purchased the building with plans to convert it into storage units. They'd sent her in to inspect the property, but she hadn't made it past the front door. They were everywhere, Janice had said over the phone, her voice trembling. Hundreds of them. I couldn't get inside. I shrugged it off. People always exaggerate when it comes to bugs. Maybe it was a termite nest, maybe a bad roach infestation. Nothing I hadn't handled before. When I arrived at the warehouse, I immediately knew something was off. The building sat at the end of a long, dusty road, surrounded by overgrown weeds and crumbling asphalt. But what caught my attention wasn't the building itself. It was the sound. A low, constant hum like the distant drone of machinery, but more organic, like the buzzing of wings. I grabbed my gear from the truck and walked toward the entrance. The air was thick, the kind of heat that made everything shimmer and feel heavier than it should. As I got closer, I noticed something odd. The ground was moving. It wasn't dirt, but a carpet of insects, tiny black beetles crawling in waves toward the building. Great, I muttered to myself. Just what I needed. Beetles. I pulled on my gloves and mask, then opened the door. Inside, the hum grew louder, almost deafening. The warehouse was massive, dimly lit by a few broken windows high on the walls. And as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it. The walls, the floor, the ceiling. Everything was moving. Thousands of beetles, maybe millions, crawling in and out of every crack, every crevice, covering the walls like a living, breathing organism. It was as if the building itself had come alive. I'd seen infestations before, but nothing like this. It was almost like the insects had taken over, like they were claiming the warehouse as their own. I stepped further inside, my boots crunching on the beetle-covered floor. As I made my way toward the center of the room, I noticed something strange. Amidst the constant scuttling, there was a pattern. The beetles weren't just randomly swarming, they were moving in organized lines, flowing toward the far end of the warehouse like a living river. I followed the trail. At the far wall, I found the source. There was a massive hole about 6 feet across, where the concrete floor had caved in. The beetles were pouring out of it like water from a broken dam, flooding the warehouse with their numbers. The hum was so loud now that I could barely hear myself think, a constant drone that seemed to vibrate in my skull. I kneeled down by the edge of the hole and shined my flashlight into the darkness below. The light barely penetrated the gloom, but what I saw made my stomach drop. There were more tunnels twisting and winding through the earth beneath the warehouse, like the burrows of some massive insect hive. And deeper in the tunnels, something moved, something large. Suddenly, the beetles began to surge, crawling over my boots, up my legs, frantically swarming toward the surface as if something had disturbed them. I scrambled back, trying to shake them off. But before I could retreat, a figure emerged from the shadows of the tunnel. It was a man, tall, gaunt, with skin as pale as the belly of a fish. He wore tattered clothes that hung off his frame like rags, and his eyes were wild, darting around the room as if searching for something. You shouldn't be here? His voice barely audible over the buzzing swarm. I stood frozen, staring at him in disbelief. Who the hell are you? He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into the hole, his hands disappearing into the darkness. When he pulled them out, they were covered in beetles, crawling up his arms, slipping into his sleeves, wriggling under his clothes. I was here before they came, he whispered, his eyes locking onto mine. But now they're part of me. I took a step back, my heart racing. What are you talking about? Who are they? He didn't respond. Instead, he smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched across his face like a mask. You'll see, he said, and then, without warning, he leaped back into the tunnel, disappearing into the darkness below. I ran out of the warehouse, my mind spinning. Whatever that was, it wasn't normal. I knew I had to report it, had to let someone know. But before I could make it to the truck, the ground trembled beneath my feet. I stopped, turning back to the warehouse. The hum had grown louder, deeper, almost a roar now. And then slowly the walls began to buckle. The concrete cracked, splitting like the shell of an egg, and the roof sagged as the building began to collapse in on itself. The beetles poured out in waves, fleeing the sinking structure. But something else was coming, something bigger. The man's words echoed in my mind. They're part of me. And I realized too late what he had meant. From the rubble, a massive shape began to emerge. It wasn't a man, or even an animal. It was something far worse, an amalgamation of thousands of beetles, all moving as one, forming a grotesque, shifting mass that pulsed with life. I didn't wait to see more. I jumped into the truck, slammed the door, and sped away, the tires kicking up dust and beetles as I tore down the road. I never went back to the warehouse. When the city inspectors arrived, they found nothing but rubble. No sign of the man, no tunnels, no beetles. Just a collapsed building and a vague report of an infestation that had been dealt with. But I know better. I know what I saw. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I still hear the hum. Faint, but there. A constant, low buzzing, just under the surface of everything. I can't shake the feeling that the beetles are still out there, burrowing deeper, spreading beneath the city, waiting. And I wonder how long it'll be before they come back, before they come for me. And that brings us to the end of tonight's journey through the darkness. If these stories kept you on edge, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for even more chilling tales. And as always, I want to hear from you. What city were you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments below and let's see just how far the shadows reach. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay safe, but remember, the darkness is always closer than you think.